All right, everybody, we're gonna get this next session going. Hopefully everyone isn't in food coma after lunch, because I know it's dark and it can be easy to get tired. Levi may or may not have something prepared to keep us on our toes. But our next presentation is going to be the new VSP Monitoring Guide workshop. Levi Kiesecker, he works as a natural resource scientist within the Voluntary Stewardship program, VSP. He works with a variety of awesome folks to help build capacity and collaborations around the science and conservation at the intersection of agriculture and critical areas. So I'll let Levi take it away.
Thank you, Drew. Thanks to everybody here. I have some friendly faces I remember from before, but for those who don't know me, my name is Levi. I work for the Washington State Conservation Commission. I started a couple years ago to kind of help support science in the program. And so today, wanted to talk to you about some new resources that are out that the commission has put out that might intersect with you, whether or not you actually do your work in a VSP county. Some of the resources are sort of independent of VSP, specific to like monitoring and just using science and resources and stuff to kind of help you with your work. And then another piece of it is if you are in a VSP county, to kind of help clarify sort of the specific guardrails of the program and as it relates to monitoring to kind of help you do your jobs or utilize science more efficiently. Cool. So just a basic outline. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the Voluntary Stewardship Program is for folks who don't know. We'll talk about how monitoring fits into VSP. There's some specific reasons for that will become clear later. We'll show you some of the resources that I talked about to help support monitoring, and then tie into, I don't know if anybody was here for the 8 o'clock session this morning about the riparian monitoring, but we're going to tie into that as an example of how district work, district monitoring could actually be useful for VSP. And then hopefully we'll have some time for an open discussion. So the V in VSP stands for voluntary. For folks who aren't familiar with VSP, it's a voluntary way to sort of deal with critical areas in contrast to critical area ordinances and regulatory approaches. And the basic gist is it's a way for counties to manage their critical areas, but also balance agricultural viability. And part of the way that we do that is using science and monitoring. For a little bit of context, at the state level, folks are concerned about protecting critical areas. And when we talk about critical areas, there's 5 types. So wetlands, frequently flooded areas, aquifer recharge areas, geologically hazardous areas, and fish and wildlife habitats. So the idea is like we as a state need to protect our critical areas. VSP is a way to do that in a non-regulatory setting. So each critical area type has a set of functions and values associated with it. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I just wanted to present this now. So just think of it this way. It's like if you have a wetland and you can see it on a map, take a photo, it has water, it's an area that has water. It might be providing functions like storing water during a flood or cleaning up water or something like that. So you can imagine that same wetland, you could take a picture of it, there might be water there, but it might not have the plants and things and the animals and the sort of the structure where it could actually provide the functions. So even though VSP is about protecting critical areas, and there's different types of critical areas, really what you're evaluating is the functions of those critical area types. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But one of the things, since this is a riparian track, I wanted to kind of highlight the ways that riparian areas actually intersect with all the different critical area types. So you think about wetlands, oftentimes are wetlands in riverine systems. And so they provide functions like slowing water down, controlling sedimentation, things like that. There's a lot of areas where riparian areas exchange water and nutrients and gases with groundwater in the hyporheic zone. Obviously, riparian areas are key for fish and wildlife habitat and on and on. So there's a bunch of ways where folks who are doing riparian work might not know it now, but might be either helping improve or protect the riparian zones then intersect with these other critical area types, or also if there's any monitoring that's going on in these areas for the projects that you're working in, that monitoring might be really useful for folks who are doing VSP in your county. So the term in the statute is functions and values of critical areas. So we just sort of talked a little bit about the functions, so like shoreline and erosion control. Values is sort of if you took the functions and you put them through the lens of society, so culture, economics, things like that, then you have what are often called ecosystem services or ecosystem values. I think there's been a few talks about, you know, payments, like paying landowners to do certain things. In a sense, that's sort of like an ecosystem service paradigm. It's worth it to this community to, you know, not have our river trash, so we're willing to pay for it, that type of thing. It doesn't always have to be monetary, and it's subjective, and it reflects the community in which you're inquiring. So each county is sort of free to define their own functions and their own values to reflect sort of local conditions and the local value systems. And one of the key things about riparian zones is that they are often like found on this list, like the cultural values associated with riparian areas, about like recreation, like I swim and canoe, I bet you guys do too. Aesthetic, spiritual, educational, like for me, all four of those fit, right? So you can see, you know, rivers and riparian systems are involved in all kinds of functions and values. They just sort of depend on where you are, how they're defined. And part of the goal of the resources that are coming is to sort of help folks get more specific about how those are defined so that you can evaluate them more clearly. So it's easier to see how things are going. So just some more context about VSP. There's 27 counties in VSP. So that's the majority of counties. And again, I just want to stress, even if you're not in a VSP county, the hope is that some of these resources could still be helpful to you. And also, I believe, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but there may be a time where there's another window open and some other counties who aren't currently in VSP might join it. So just an FYI there. And then this is just to show, you know, this isn't a perfect data set, but there's a lot of riparian areas all over the state. And I just based on the presentations I've seen the last couple of days, you know, I know a ton of work is going on in these areas. So a lot of opportunities to kind of leverage that effort. So this is another sort of contextual bit of information to kind of contrast. So that previous map you saw where the VSP counties are and the non-VSP counties are. So if you're a non-VSP county, you're kind of in the Regulatory Growth Management Act, this left side here. And the distinctions turn out to matter quite a bit, especially in terms of the monitoring, right? So if you're in a regulatory setup, you're looking at like parcel by parcel, can someone do something? They maybe need to go get a permit or ask permission, or if there's constraints, you know, you can do X, Y, or Z if you meet these kind of criteria for your farm or your plot. And it's sort of like a one size fits all, like these are the rules, and however you fit in this umbrella is sort of what your options are. Or maybe sometimes it can be negotiated to keep like a variance for like a specific project or something. But for the most part, it's like a cookie cutter. You apply it at the parcel level, you presume it's effective, which is why you set up whatever, you know, however the governance is there, they set up the rules in order to make it so if you follow the rules, we presume that things are going to protect the critical areas that we care about. It's regulatory. Monitoring is not required often because you're presuming that because you're limiting the amount of activities that are going on, you don't need to monitor. You just know things are going to be protected, right? So the contrast to that is within VSP, we're not looking at parcels, we're looking at a watershed. So overall, what are the trends in the watershed? The actions that you take are site specific. So similar to the kinds of conversations you have with landowners about what kind of BMPs to put in, it depends on the context, you know, the type of property, where it's located, the personality, the options, et cetera. So it's a little more flexible. The effectiveness model is to demonstrate it. So that's through monitoring, right? You have to demonstrate it with data, and you need that data to be better than random, or as objective as possible assessment of what's going on. And it's voluntary, so folks don't have to participate if they don't want to, but they can. Monitoring is required. So that's sort of where the rubber meets the road in a sense. because you can fail out of VSP if your monitoring is showing that you're not protecting critical areas, or if you don't have sufficient monitoring to really be able to tell. So that's part of the focus of this talk here, is to just highlight some of the resources that are geared to kind of help you answer those questions. So another piece of the context here is like, who administers VSP? The sort of center of gravity is the county. So each VSP county has a work plan that was developed previously that is continuously adaptively managed, so that you can change things. You can change the way that you're monitoring, you can change goals and benchmarks, et cetera. The counties have created these VSP work groups that are composed of stakeholders from a bunch of different backgrounds, and each county's work group looks a little bit different. They typically meet like every 3 months or so, sometimes more frequently. And, you know, they sort of assess what's going on. Where are projects going in? Where are we having issues with critical areas? Is the county, you know, approving developments in some areas that might relate to ag lands? Should we know about that? You know, if we're going to lose a wetland to that, should we restore another wetland to offset it, right? So those decisions are constantly being made by a group of people who come from different backgrounds and bring different perspectives and expertise, which turns out to be really helpful. And among those are conservation district staff. Most of the VSP groups, work groups that I work with, have some conservation district staff either in the work group, coordinating with the work group, or their projects and activities are being used by the work group to make decisions. So part of this is also just an FYI to folks who may not know about it. You might not know, but maybe you're already doing work that is being used by VSP. And sort of the other layer to that, so there's the VSP work groups, but there's also all this other capacity at state level, at the federal level, at the county level. So that can be like special programs that WSDA has about, you know, specialty cropping systems and things. They might have some monitoring going on around pesticides. Obviously, Department of Fish and Wildlife has all kinds of different staff and people and things going on. So some work groups have staff from these agencies on their work group. Some of them just leverage some of the projects or the data or things that are going on at those agencies in order to use VSP without actually officially having folks on a work group. But the idea is it's this, it's a network of a bunch of different stakeholders from different backgrounds, and it's kind of tricky, but the goal is to sort of like tie that all together. And that's where the county and the work groups and the work plans sort of come in. So you saw before, monitoring is required in VSP, but there's a few nuances that really matter. So one is that, again, we're talking about the functions and values of critical areas, not just critical areas in general. And that will hopefully be more clear why I'm setting it up this way in a few more slides. But the other issue is that you're looking at the watershed scale. So you're not looking at a parcel and saying, did this farm improve like after 5 years or after 10 years? You're saying in this whole watershed, however you define that, you know, because watersheds are different sizes depending on how you define it. But the idea is it's not one property owner. It's not like you're focused on a specific person. You're saying, is the sum of all what we're doing within a watershed in general, at least protecting the functions and values of the critical areas that we defined, or maybe enhancing them. Or if things are degrading, then you need to adaptively manage to kind of get things back on the right track. You could use that work group to do that. So there's actually a lot of different themes within VSP that relate to monitoring participation. So are people voluntarily doing things? There are some counties where, for example, they don't have a lot of participation from orchardists, but they have lots of participation from wheat growers. And so there's a way you can kind of monitor that, use the information to help you do outreach at places that you might need to spend some more time. Ag viability, so that's a part of VSP as well. And that can also be monitored. And then implementation, it's like, where are things going in? Where are you putting in projects? How many projects? What type of projects? How big are the projects? And then the effectiveness piece is where we're going to focus today, because that is you can't fail out of ESP for the other types of monitoring, but you can fail out for the effectiveness. You have to show the effectiveness. And like I said before, you know, there's two ways. If the effectiveness is showing that you're not effective, but the data is good and you can't adaptively manage your way out, then you risk failing out. Or if you don't have sort of scientifically justifiable data to show that you're being effective, then potentially you could fail at as well. So a fair amount of this monitoring guide, which just came out last month, is sort of geared towards that, to kind of help folks who are maybe partway down the road for effectiveness monitoring, or maybe using QAPs from different agencies or things like that, just to help provide in a clear, kind of concise way as possible, how that might fit into VSP so that we don't have an issue where it's a problem with the data. Like everything's actually going well. It's just the data wasn't put together in a way that folks who are outside the system could say, oh yeah, that's working, right? I think in a lot of cases, that's what's happening. It's like counties are doing all kinds of good work, but they just don't have the data to really show it. And so that's super critical for this program. And that's part of this monitoring guide, which you can access. There's a link here. I think Drew will post the slides.
Yeah,
At some point, yeah. So you can click the link here. It's on the Commission's website, on the VSP website. You can access it now. I'll refer to some different elements of that throughout this talk here. And again, just trying to adjust this for riparian. You know, the umbrella VSP is very broad, but like I said, there's a lot of intersection with riparian. So monitoring is tracking something for a purpose, not just tracking something. So like if I'm just taking my blood pressure, but like there's no reason for me to take it, like I'm not doing anything with it, I'm just like, oh, that's interesting. It's not really monitoring, right? Like you're collecting data, but like it's not for anything. So I think that oftentimes happens like this, you know, it's like your boss says to monitor a cloud. It's like, well, why would I monitor the cloud? I don't know. You just said monitor it. So we can just watch it, you know, and you might take some data, but like, what are you going to do with that? So part of the goal, part of one of my goals is to kind of help make sure that the data that is being collected can fit into a purpose so that it's easier when you have to report on things to kind of clarify, you know, how things are going. So referring to the guide again, there's sort of two parts to it. One is any kind of monitoring you're doing. I was talking to someone earlier who was interested in cedar, wild cedar, and the range of it and whether it's changing. That might not be part of VSP, but if you were doing that project, you would want to have some goals for what you're doing. You want to like have some underlying question, like I think the range is contracting, or there's more die-offs or whatever, things like that. And then you need to know, like, is the way I'm measuring it, if I'm doing my blood pressure, you know, if the instrument I'm using has an error rate of like, I don't know, 40%, and I kind of need to know like a little bit more specifically, maybe that's not the best monitoring approach, right? So all these sort of elements here on the left are just sort of basically any kind of monitoring. And we try to put in the guide a bunch of different references, like clarify some of these concepts, have some workable examples, have links to other projects where folks have done this. And then sort of combine that with the VSP stuff. So we have implementation and effectiveness, participation, ag viability, but also some language that's specific to the VSP program. So watershed scales, functions and values, adaptive management, all that type of stuff. So I think even if you're not in a VSP county, you might find some information in this guide useful. And if you are in a VSP county, I really encourage you to read, especially the first volume, because that's where all the stuff on watershed scales and everything is clarified. I think that really helps funnel you to a more manageable place in terms of monitoring. Yeah, this is just an example of some of that, right? Like if you have some data, again, we talked about, you need data that kind of meets the scientific standards, essentially. And that means something to do with probabilities. So you need to have kind of like a p-value or some version of that. And there's different ways, kind of an art. Some of the data analysis is a little bit like an art. And so if your data looks like this, you probably can't use just a normal statistical t-test or something. You need to maybe transform the data first. It can't be transformed. You can use a non-parametric technique, but it's good to be armed with all that ahead of time to make your life easier and not like banging your head on the computer. So that's in the guide. Similar stuff. There's some technical stuff. It's mostly in the second volume. If you don't need it, you don't need it, but it's there if you do. I think for most folks who are using, who are doing projects that are funded by grants that have QAPPs, most of them I think are set up with this kind of stuff in mind, but it's there for reference. And, you know, just in a general way, it's good to just be clear on things like, is the way that we're measuring something really reflective of the reality on the ground, right? And so in this case, if you send 1,000 mailers and 98% of them are from people who love to respond to surveys, you know, can you really infer that like the majority of that population really likes surveys? Probably not, because a bunch of people just didn't send their surveys in, right? So there's sometimes they're actually, like the monitoring and statistics and data analysis can be kind of complicated, but if you just step back a minute and think about some of the essential elements, it will help you avoid traps like this. So kind of getting back to the work that you're already probably doing in some way, shape or form, using some kind of protocols or methods or information to do the work that you do. Oftentimes, I think there's low-hanging fruit where that could actually be packaged up at a watershed scale, or it could be shared with folks. Maybe it itself isn't enough to cover 100% of the monitoring need, but it could be really helpful to share with someone who's working in VSP. They could use that information to figure out, oh, if we just double the amount that we're doing, we could actually get to the objectives that we want, right? Things about like if you're doing a project and it's upstream, maybe, but you don't have a downstream yet, maybe it would make sense to just add a downstream station if you're doing something with surface water that has a directionality like that. Because if you don't have the downstream, but you just have the upstream, then you're totally limited on what you can say with that data, right? So a lot of times it's just, they're, in a sense, they're relatively simple tweaks just to set you up for success. Or are you comparing two different watersheds, you know? Sort of depends on what your goals are. And again, a lot of this is kind of illustrated in the monitoring guide. Also things like we're measuring something here, but there's stuff coming from forest land or another county. So by the time the water gets into our watershed or our county, it's already kind of warm, but that has nothing to do with us, you know, that kind of stuff. It kind of helps frame your monitoring and help you be more clear about what you reasonable expectations for changes in critical areas if there's already background conditions and background stressors that are outside of your control. It's just ways to kind of help frame that up. And in addition to so the guide's got the content, kind of walks you through some things. It also has a bunch of links. So to other folks who know a ton of stuff. So all about watersheds, data sources, if you want to like look at stream flows and things, there's all kinds of cool apps and different resources out there. So those are linked throughout the guide, kind of with an aim towards figuring out like, where are you? You know, if your baseline condition is here, you just want to know that at the watershed scale, you're not going this way, right? And there's a VSP library of resources now, also at this link. I was going to do a little tour, but I don't know if we'll have time. So I think I'll just save it for now, but you can get the gist. So it's like this idea, if you want to know about ag lands, there's the Washington State Ag Lands Database, priority habitats and species. I think there was a session on that today, maybe later. So there's links to those data sets, GIS data, mapping stuff, data from ecology, standard operating procedures for doing riparian stuff. So like the green line that was talked about this morning, or the SVAP, that's in there as well. And you can search for this column that says tag. So whatever, you could go in there and just say, hey, I want to look at riparian zones, and it'll filter all the other stuff out. So you're just looking at one thing. Well, I want to look at riparian zones in shrub step. And so that'll look at, you know, so it's just a way to kind of, rather than sort through like 1,000 resources, it's a way to kind of help you target what you might need. Also linked on the VSP website. Okay. So another part of it that's, again, is sort of nuanced. On paper, it sounds kind of simple. It's like, oh, we're just monitoring at the watershed scale instead of the parcel scale. But actually, it's kind of complicated because it really depends, because you saw before the nested watersheds, right? So it sort of depends on, are you looking at the sub watershed or like a larger Wyra, Raya, Huck sized, watershed? This example here is, let's just say these are riparian zones and the function is erosion control on the stream bank. The green arrow means that since 2011, there's more erosion control, right? So the function's going up. But in reality, like, it's not going to happen everywhere. Some of those sites aren't going to recover as well. Maybe you're going to have a decrease. So the idea is, if you sum all those arrows up, which direction are you headed, right? So when you have these three subwatersheds aggregated together, it looks like there's a slight degradation. But if you look at it just one subbasin at a time, actually some of the subbasins, like this one's being enhanced, right? This one's being degraded. So it sort of depends on how you lump or how you split what your outcome is. So it's good to be really clear on that. And again, there's more info on that in the guide. Here's another example. If you had a question because you wanted to show a funder or someone, what are the main factors driving functions and values in a riparian zone? Or these 303D listed water bodies or the interactions between them. And you can see here, it's like on the right, this is the same data. On the right-hand side, you have everything aggregated in one watershed, and it looks like, oh, things are kind of declining, but you can't really tell why. You have some ag, you have some urban. If you have it sort of divided up in sub-watersheds, it's easier to see what signal's coming from where. So in this case, it's like, well, a lot of things driving the downward trend actually doesn't have anything to do with agriculture. It's because there's not even ag in those sub-watersheds. But being really clear on what scale you're asking that question will help you disentangle that. The point here is that in the guide, there's a list of functions and values. It's not completed. The guide itself will be adaptively managed over time. So we'll be adding more to it, but we got input from different stakeholders and through the kind of revision of this guide. So there's quite a few for each of the critical area types, wetlands, fish and wildlife, all the rest of it. So it's just an FYI there. And then when you're trying to think about what indicators or what kind of field assessments you could do or mapping or whatever the approaches are that you're looking at, oftentimes you're using indicators. So like a standard operating procedure for a field method or something like that. Those are based usually on some combination of the structure and composition of like plant communities or soils or whatever that sort of manifests in the function. So functions themselves are actually a little bit somewhat removed from what you're actually measuring. And so again, there's more info in the guide about how you can borrow pieces to kind of help you answer your question in a way that's not overly time consuming. And I'm going to show an example. So this is from Anthony's presentation this morning. He was talking about some of the riparian methods that Palouse Conservation District is using. And he was gracious and shared this with me ahead of time. But the idea here is that, so this column on the left are different methods. So photo points, I'm doing a cross section of a riparian zone. I'm doing a green line, which is like a specific kind of operating procedure out in the field, using a quadret, or this SVAP is like an NRCS method, right? And you can see that they're doing different monitoring at different times for sort of different questions, right? Which I think is super awesome. I love that talk. And the folks at Palouse are doing really great work. Here's an example of how this sort of fits in with VSP. If you did a green line, you might be essentially what you are learning from that is related to like how stable is the bank? It's related to erosion. Are the plants surviving? What are the plants in this area? What is it composed of? That like the identities of the different plants, maybe the proportion of them. So you can answer certain questions that would relate to functions. So this could relate to erosion control, right? But you can't, each method sort of constrains you to what function you're looking at, right? If you compare that to an SVAP, which is the NRCS approach, it's more complicated, but detailed. So you might get more detailed, better information in a sense, but it might take more time to do. So you're assessing physical, chemical, and biological things, maybe macroinvertebrates. Maybe you're going to use a stream probe and actually measure dissolved oxygen and stuff like that. That's like another level of detail compared to some other methods. VSP doesn't say one method is better than another one. I think the goal is to help folks find the methods that make the most sense based on the questions they have. And if there isn't an existing method that 100% meets their needs, to give you enough information that you could borrow bits and pieces from other things or create your own thing that will make it efficient. So you have enough time to do it in the field. It's not overly costly. Yeah, so that pretty much is the visual representation of what I just said. And then the point here is like the idea is that data then goes back to the work groups. So they can use that information. I heard this morning, I think some of what they measure in addition to the plant communities and stuff is like, did they use like mesh or netting or different ways that they're doing the restorations, right? And so then they internally can see over time that like, depending, the restorations that we did it this way are actually more successful than the ones that we did this way. So now we're going to do, the ones that were successful more. We're going to adaptively manage and sort of move. The idea that data is powerful, and if you collect it in a way that's thoughtful, you can save yourself a lot of time in the future and help you and your own group just make more efficient, better decisions based on good info. But that all kind of depends on the underlying data that you're using and making sure that that's solid too. Because the worst thing that could happen is if you aren't clear and you think the data is telling you that things are moving in the right direction, but they're actually moving in the wrong direction, or vice versa. You think the data seems to be telling you things are going in the wrong direction, so you spend a bunch of time and money to kind of turn it around, when in fact it wasn't going in the wrong direction. It's just the data you used wasn't accurate, right? So again, that's part of the goal of the guide and the library. So in short, monitoring of critical area functions values has to be done in VSP. Riparian zones interact with those critical areas that are part of VSP. The riparian monitoring or projects that you're already doing could be really useful for VSP. There's trade-offs in terms of how much time and money it takes to do this kind of stuff and how good of an answer you need. And there are ways you can kind of thread the needle to find a balance that will work for you. And you can get support for that through that guide and the link, through the library resources, and then through your colleagues. So we have been doing VSP monitoring symposia about every 3 months. And that likely will continue moving forward. So those are good opportunities. And then plus you saw in the previous slides, all the different folks at the different state agencies, federal agencies, county departments, other districts are doing all kinds of cool stuff. So there's lots of ways you can just learn from each other. And that's it. Here's the team that's related to VSP at the commission. Several of them are here. And I think with that, I will stop for questions. Yes.
When you say you fail, tell me what that means.
Bill? Sorry.
What that means is that that would be at the county level. The county would fail out of VSP, and there's a certain section of statute that determines what they have to do, what they have to do. But essentially, if you go back into that regulatory system, out of voluntary back into a junior.
I'm just gonna, since we have a second, I'm just gonna pull the library up. Drew reminded me we have some time. Any other questions? Who is in here is from a VSP county? Oh, right on. Okay, quite a few. Cool. Who in here who's from a VSP county is engaging with VSP, or the data from your projects is being used in VSP? It's like half-ish. All right, cool. just real quick, I was going to show you this just in real life. So this is that library of resources. There's like 60 things in here. The idea is you just go up here. I want to filter by like a topic, essentially, you know, ag lands, climate change, connectivity. Let's go down to riparian. So now we're down to 16 out of 62. And then if you want to keep, you know, narrowing it down, you could say you want to do riparian in shrub step, or it's a field assessment, or, you know, let's see, do I have shrub step in here? Yeah. I guess there's none. That was not the best example. But there are some for shrub step, right? Sage grouse, etc. So just FYI, that's for use. It sounds like most of you are already in VSP counties, but you don't have to be to use the library. So, yeah. Yes. Oh, quality assurance project plan, I think. Protection plan. Usually, like if you get it, not always, but for the most part, if you're getting a money from like EPA or ecology or something, you will have to do a quality assurance protection plan projects. I'm not totally sure what that would mean. And I've had to do one for EPA, and it's like really mind numbing. It's like 200 pages. You know, like how long is the bottle of water going to sit in the cooler before it goes to the lab? You know, all that kind of stuff. Some of them are really, really detailed. So oftentimes funders require it. And then oftentimes the methods that you see that already exist, so like the point line intercept or the green line or the SVAP or something, those sort of have the science is sort of built into them, thinking about QAPs, right? So it actually, a lot of those methods have sort of the QAP built in. And then VSP, I think the monitoring guide is sort of like VSP's version of the QAP.
My other question was, in terms of statistical analysis, like I don't know much about R. So right now, we don't do any customer, and if we were to do it down the road, that's something that if there's support for others to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can help you. There's at least a couple handfuls of people I can think of that are kind of in our ecosystem that have those kinds of skills that would be happy to share them with you. And then as far as the specialized software, I think, you know, honestly, a lot of, depending on how sophisticated you're wanting to get, but some of this stuff is, you could just do it in Excel, you know, like you can do t-tests and stuff in there. It's not the best necessarily, but for kind of simple things you can. And I don't know where things will go, but I can also think of like about 5 or 6 folks at the district world who are using R and things like that. So there might be ways to just have like smaller work groups kind of and share with each other. Same kind of thing with GIS. I feel like some staff are like coding and stuff in GIS, and other folks are just kind of using it for mapping. And so there's a way, I think there are ways to kind of leverage our collective knowledge together. So just, yeah, reach out maybe after this, or we could chat afterwards too. You have more on that. Yep. The questions? Yes, Dave.
So, something we've talked about before, in everybody's county plan, you know, pick a critical area and you can either take it on or use a regulatory backstop. And so, I'm looking for a good definition of a regulatory backstop.
Bill?
And so, in the context of, okay, you know, in our 5-year report, we didn't really find that there was much activity in this area. So, you know, should we just use the regulatory backstop and not monitor it? I guess that's the thought, and I think there's a lot of confusion about what exactly a regulatory backstop is.
it's, I would be very careful about going around. Those counties that use the regulatory backstop, the one that comes to mind, for me is Skagit. So they use the regulatory backstop for their 5 critical areas. So what that means is the ag community in Skagit has to, it is regulated in those 4 critical areas. And only one are they not. Only one that they have this voluntary system going. So I would just be careful about bringing that to your ag community, just for those kind of policy implications. It does make things easier for them, right? Because they use a variety of programs and policies that they have in place. So they don't have to monitor those 4 others. They don't have to monitor them, but they still, for VSP purposes, have to establish that they're meeting their those benchmarks in those 4 areas. So yes, they don't have to monitor them, but they have to do something to be able to convince the technical panel and our commission's director that they're meeting that state statutory standard. So it's not necessarily a get out of jail free card kind of situation. So it might not be the panacea that folks are thinking it is. Let's not deal with that thing. You're going to have to deal with it one way or another, and you're kind of shifting the burden a little bit from the voluntary side to the regulatory side when you do that. And that may be okay. Like in Skagit, they have those programs that have been around for a long time, and thankfully has some of those, and you're okay with that. Maybe not so much for your county, right? So that's my word of caution on that.
So I guess, yeah, so I guess, what we read into with the Friday report was, aquifer recharge areas. And, you know, we have in my county, we have, you know, at roads to all the land. And so, we were really struggling to, like, and like a lot of plans, we were depending on publicly available data for what we're using, and it was really difficult to go through the Department of Health stuff and figure out, you know, okay, well, was that actually impacting critical recharge, optical recharges? And so it finally cut down to, you know, what I did as part of the health chain, and it's like, hey, can you answer me this question? Since 2011, has there been any exceedances with the Department of Health that related to agriculture? And he said, we need to get back here. And he got back to me and he said no. And so I guess, you know, rather than kind of scratch our heads and try to figure out, hey, should we be trying to monitor something where there hasn't been an exceedance in 10 years, according to the Department of Health, would it make sense to just, you know, chop that one up to a little bit of backside? And I guess the second part of that would be is if we did have an exceedance with the Department of Health. So, was that when we would use VSP to adaptively manage some sort of agricultural practice to remedy that? I mean, does that make sense?
Yes, and it sort of depends on where your goals and benchmarks are in your work for aquifer storage. And I think that the evidence of the violations from the Department of Health is one of those data points you can use. There might be some others that you can use as well. And if aquifer storage is not a big ag concern in your county, then it might make sense to go that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're just, you know, honestly trying to take a few things off of our plate, you know, where is it really a big issue in our county? That was one that kind of stood out. It's like, it's not an issue. And so, you know, should we adaptively manage our plan and say, hey, we're not going to, you know, we're going to use a regulatory backstop because it didn't really seem like, you know, that was, such a small chance that it's actually going to be.
Yeah, and that's what that adaptive management aspect of VSP is all about, is that sort of thing, where we thought this was gonna be something we needed to have goals and benchmarks for. It turns out it's not such a big deal for these reasons, and for that reason, you're gonna go to a regulatory scheme for that.
So, you know, so we just decided that at a meeting, kind of talk about it, and then how would we report?
We have a policy advice, we have a plan. But yeah, essentially that's a very short version of what we do. You would modify your work plan to say you're going to use this other regulatory scheme, but you have to have that in place. You guys have to put something in place, right? You don't already have that, something on the schedule.
But if you do that, and you go back on the regulatory scheme, you cannot use VSP or that to manage to address the problem. You give that up to the regulatory scheme. What you described there, I think, is a little bit different. So what you were describing was using not necessarily a regulatory backstop in the monitoring context, you're using data from Department of Health about aquifer conditions. That what you're saying is, I'm just going to rely on that, and if they're not showing any diseases or any problems, then that's my monitoring. And I think that is okay, because going back to what Levi was saying earlier, with the VSP standard, you're maintaining your standard at that level. Okay. Where you would have a problem is if you get a report. What you're saying is for when it comes to aquifer recharge and aquifer conditions, we're going to go with health data. If their data comes back at any point and says we have a problem here, then we can use VSP to identify the problem and adaptively manage using VSP program outreach and so forth and so on to address those problems. If you go in and change your work plan and say, for aquifer recharge, we're just going to rely on a regulatory backstop. If there are problems down the road, then the answer is a regulatory approach to enforcement.
So at that point, we couldn't swap that and say, hey, you know, there's an issue here.
VSP can't bounce back.
You can't bounce that. So basically what you're saying is you know, we should stick with what we have now and just look at the Department of data. You know, the problem, and our county may be in that we depended on publicly available data and it keeps busy. And so, it seems like, you know, is that our problem, or is that, you know, ecology and Department of Health's problem? And there's, I mean, that's what the serious rub is like, you know, we need to, because if we have to develop a monitoring program for our critical aquifer recharge areas, independent of what the Department of Health is doing, to say, hey, we are doing things here, even though there's been no problem detected since 2011. That's going to be hard to do for, you know, for our county. And so,
But some have said, just to channel some of the ag community that was involved in the VSP negotiation, creating a program, and also channel your neighbor, kind of commissioner that's on the state advisory committee. Some have said VSP should require you to do a lot more than what the jurisdiction would have to do under GMA. So under GMA, we didn't necessarily ask to go and do all this, the additional monitoring that you described, not for recharge context. My answer would be no. What they do is rely on that same data you just referenced from the other company. So that's what I would do, just say we're going to rely on this data. We have a small watershed. We think the data that it signifies a problem, then you can focus resources on areas to identify the source of the problem and use VSP, all the stewardship plans and so forth to address the problem.
yeah, so I think
But
that,
in your 5-year report, you report
Yeah.
out, hey, here's what the data is showing. The data is showing no change in this particular event.
so I guess, you know, in August, you know, I had a chance to talk to the and this is the question I'm going to bring up, because yeah, I think probably me and I on exactly the same page, and, you know, Western Coast probably on.
Percentage, even that, same thing. We could have wrong book.
Yeah, exactly, that was my point, and so when we start talking to the regulators, you know, at the meeting in August, they're gonna say, you know, no, you need to come up. You know, even though our plan says, you know, we're using publicly available data, they approved it, there seems to be a, you know, rub right now with the regulatory agencies that say, you know, you need to monitor, you know, no matter, you know, even though we said we were gonna, you know, we were gonna be able to use our data, we don't have any data, so you need.
Just talk about.
Okay.
That's a big deal.
Thank you. Awesome conversation. Sorry, I think Drew's got to prepare for the next session. So, thanks all.
It's fine.